No problem. I think everyone is starting to settle in. Welcome here. Welcome on this rainy Vancouver night. My name is Dr. John Martins. I'm the director of the Center for Christian Engagement. I would like to begin with a land acknowledgement. I acknowledge that the land on which we gather is the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. In future events, we will seek to hear directly from a number of First Nations voices in order to listen, learn, and act. One of the goals of the Center for Christian Engagement is that we continue to reach out to our First Nations brothers and sisters. The Center for Christian Engagement is at heart a center that emphasizes the importance of listening, reflecting, learning, discussing, and praying as we explore the Christian and Catholic intellectual tradition, which is what we'll be doing here tonight with Gabrielle Earnshaw. I want to also thank our generous founding donors to the center, Peter Bull, Angus Reed, and Andy Sachs. We're thankful for their commitment to the life of the academic world and the work of the church in the world. I also want to acknowledge the support of the Cullen family, who are here with us tonight again. They've been generous in their support, not just financially, but in their presence, and we appreciate that. Their support of these lectures allows these lectures to take place and allows us to bring in stellar speakers from Toronto, such as Gabrielle Earnshaw. St. Mark's Center for Christian Engagement seeks to enable the creation of a culture of encounter and dialogue by creating opportunities to address the challenges associated with the disengagement of Christians from the church and the life of faith. We're thankful for all of you who have joined us here in person tonight and for the many more of you who have joined us online. We welcome you wherever you are, and we welcome your participation. Those of you who are joining us virtually have an opportunity to ask questions, and hopefully we'll be able to get to as many of those questions, both in person and online, as possible. This evening's lecture is by Gabrielle Earnshaw, A Sorrow Shared, the Spiritual Teachings of Henri Nouwen. We're pleased to have Gabrielle Earnshaw here to offer the lecture on a topic that is so relevant for the church and the world today. She's speaking on a thinker whose reach goes far beyond the Catholic Church of which he was a part, to Christians of all sorts and to people of no formal faith. When I mentioned this lecture to a number of family and friends, none of them Catholic, 3 of them mentioned that they owned a copy of The Return of the Prodigal Son. And not just owned it, they had read it. That's something different too. Gabrielle Earnshaw is well positioned to offer us this lecture. She is the founding archivist for the Henri Nouwen Archives, a position she held for 16 years. During these years at St. Michael's College in Toronto, at the University of Toronto, she was the head of special collections and rare books. She left St. Mike's in 2016 to pursue editing and writing full-time. Since then, she has published 4 books, including her recent book, Henri Nouwen and the Return of the Prodigal Son, The Making of a Spiritual Classic. This was published in 2020, and for those of you lucky enough to be with us, there are 10 copies for sale for only $20 at the end of the lecture, or 11 maybe with this one. She's also been the editor for 3 volumes of Nouwen's writing, 2 of which You Are the Beloved, Daily Meditations for Spiritual Living, and Following Jesus, Finding Our Way Home in an Age of Anxiety. Both collections of Nouwen's writing edited by Earnshaw. Our speaker is a consultant to the Henri Nouwen Legacy Trust and is consulted by others around the world on matters related to Nouwen's legacy. While it's not yet been officially announced, I think I'm able to tell you that Gabrielle Earnshaw was named the official biographer for Henri Nouwen by the Henri Nouwen Legacy Trust in June 2021 and has begun to write the authorized biography with an expected publication date of 2025. Congratulations. Earnshaw holds a BA Honors from Queen's University in History and a Master's of Archival Studies from the University of British Columbia. She lived in Vancouver for 4 years. For 2 years, she was in classes and then spent a year writing a master's thesis, and then stayed another year for her first job as a newly minted archivist. At the North Vancouver Museum and Archives, she worked on the extensive and fascinating records of the Burrard Dry Dock Company. Immediately after their closure in 1992, she would also like you to know, and I think this is important, that she locked eyes once with a whale on a ferry to Vancouver Island. A truly West Coast experience. I don't think you can do that in Toronto, not yet. The center of the universe doesn't allow everything. A few practicalities before we begin. At the end of the lecture, I'll field questions from the audience, including from the online chat forum. I do ask that you try to keep your questions timely because our time is limited and because so many people might have questions, and we want the opportunity for everyone to be able to ask them and to have the opportunity to speak and to engage this important topic of a significant spiritual figure. Now, please welcome to the Center for Christian Engagement in St. Mark's College, our esteemed speaker, Gabrielle Earnshaw.
Lovely introduction. Thank you, John, for that lovely introduction and to help me remember the time that I was here working for the Burrard Dry Dock Fond, as we say in archival world. It was quite an experience, and it's nice to remember it. So tonight I'm talking about sorrow and loss. The talk is called A Sorrow Shared, the spiritual teachings of Henri Nouwen on moving from loss to hope. We are living through a time of great upheaval, fear, and suffering. Our collective and personal losses are staggering. How do we mourn our losses and find hope and courage for the future? I notice in myself a persistent state of grief. It's anticipatory grief and a reactivation of early trauma and loss. It flows, of course, between and betwixt the ordinary moments of my life, between the tender moments of kinship, between the nourishment of beauty and goodness. But grief is there, flowing in the underground stream of my life. Today, I am grieving the distressing fragmentation of society, the growing silos of people who are suspicious of others outside their group. My heart weeps at the ugly reality of Canada's colonial past as we finally acknowledge the unmarked graves of Indigenous children. I mourn the degradation of our beautiful planet, the loss of entire species, the coral reef, old-growth forest, and Arctic ice. I grieve the rampant run of greed that has created suffering in all quarters of the globe. On a personal level, I grieve the long protracted death of my friend Lynn to a rare form of cancer. I grieve the aging of my friend Sue, who has become like a second mother to me. And I grieve the recent diagnosis of breast cancer in my friend Jen. And deep within, I continue to ache with the loss of my only son, Heiko, who died 13 years ago at the age of 4 from acute myeloid leukemia. When I faced this terrible loss of Heiko, I had been Henri Nouwen's archivist for 8 years. I had read every book this gifted spiritual thinker had written and almost every letter he penned. I had sorted through his manuscripts and his teaching notes and had met many of his friends and family. While I was deeply impacted by his penetrating insights about the spiritual life, I had no idea that it was all preparation, a kind of apprenticeship for how to live my son's illness and eventual death. For Nouwen's terrain of inquiry is suffering. He taught me how to understand, live, and even give meaning to this cataclysmic event in my life. You will have your own litany of loss. Like me, you may be experiencing different kinds of loss simultaneously on both a personal and global level. How will you live these losses? Much pain is beyond our personal control. And yet, as Nouwen understood, we retain the power to choose how we will respond when suffering comes our way. In his book, Here and Now, Henri writes, "We do have a choice, not so much in regard to the circumstances of our life, but in the way that we respond to these circumstances. Two people can be victims of the same accident. For one, it becomes the source of resentment. For the other, the source of gratitude. That does not mean that the life of those who become bitter was harder than the life of those who became joyful. It means that different choices were made, inner choices, choices of the heart." Tonight, I want to share some of the choices I made under Henri's tutelage to move from loss to hope. Perhaps some of what I share with you will resonate and help you with choices you are making. Henri Nouwen can be trusted as a guide on this topic because he knows the landscape of brokenness. And with a gentle and sensitive heart, he invites us through it. The crux of his struggle was loneliness. Henri had hundreds of friends. His classes were filled to capacity. Thousands showed up for his talks. Letters from readers arrived by the hundreds each month. But somewhere in his core, he questioned his lovability. This need for affirmation began in childhood and continued until his death. It was the hungry ghost of longing. In his classic book, The Wounded Healer, Nouwen writes, "The more I think about loneliness, the more that I think that the wound of our loneliness is like the Grand Canyon, a deep incision at the surface of our existence, which has become an inexhaustible source of beauty and self-understanding." I find that last line just particularly stunning. Henri Nouwen experiences loneliness as a deep incision in his existence. Yet he chooses to see its generativity, its beauty, and its link to self-understanding. Can we, like Henri, look to our pain for beauty and self-understanding? Leonard Cohen did. Our famous Canadian bard responded to the darkness and chaos of the world with much the same spirit as Henri. In his song Anthem, he writes, "The birds sang at the break of day. Start again, I seem to hear them say. Do not dwell on what has passed away or that which is yet to be. Now the wars, they will be fought again. The holy dove will be caught again. Bought and sold and caught again, the dove is never free. Ring the bells that still can ring. Forget your perfect offering. There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in." Henri's wound of loneliness persisted all his life, yet he, like Leonard Cohen, learned to see it as a gift of light. It would become the source of his most profound insights. Let me tell you a little bit about Henri Nouwen, our guide for moving from loss to hope. Henri Nouwen was born in 1932 in Holland. Considered a leading Catholic spiritual writer of the 20th century, he was the author of 39 books that have sold millions of copies around the world and have been translated into more than 34 languages. After seminary and ordination, Nouwen studied psychology. In his 30s, he moved to the United States, where he spent the next 20 years teaching at prestigious schools like Notre Dame, Yale, and Harvard. He spoke to crowded lecture halls and conferences around the world and became known for his inclusivity and ecumenism. Periodically, he explored a monastic vocation in a Trappist monastery in upstate New York. For a time, he lived in Peru and Bolivia to work in solidarity with the poor. And then in 1985, when he was 53 years old, Nouwen resigned from Harvard Divinity School. He moved to L'Arche Daybreak, a community near Toronto where people with and without intellectual disabilities live in community together. He became their pastor. Community living created a sense of belonging, which was very healing for Henri. He spent the rest of his life as a member of L'Arche before his unexpected death at the age of 64 in 1996. Henri had a remarkable ability to articulate his own inner experience, which in turn spoke to and resonated with people all over the globe. This book was written just for me, is an oft-quoted word of praise from his legions of devoted readers. What stands out about Henri is his ability to reach across the political and religious spectrum. His readers run from Catholics to evangelical Protestants and everything in between. For many of his readers, he was like a best friend, someone who listens to their pain and isn't scandalized by it. He relieves our own suffering by being so brutally honest with his own. Reading a book by Henri Nouwen is like finding a safe place to acknowledge hidden struggles, to wrestle with God, and to be vulnerable. Nouwen wrote about the many challenges we all face at one time or another: loss, sickness, injustice, finding and losing love, discerning a career or vocation, handling conflict, managing our emotions, and coping with self-doubt. And beyond all of these sufferings, he described a much deeper human darkness, the darkness of not feeling truly welcome in human existence. Henri was fearless in bringing this darkness into the light. And that's what makes his teachings so resonant. He gives us courage to go deeper and makes us feel like we're not alone. He says, "I am convinced that healing is often so difficult because we don't want to know the pain." How would Henri Nouwen help us face our pain today? What would Henri Nouwen say to us about living our losses? First, I think he would gently invite us to name them. Sometimes we minimize what has happened to us. Sometimes we pretend our losses aren't real. Sometimes we keep them hidden from our friends and colleagues, and even from ourselves. Sometimes we convince ourselves that our losses are little in comparison to our gains. And sometimes we blame others for what we have suffered and lost instead of feeling what we feel. But for Henri, there is another option: the possibility of mourning. He wrote, "You cannot talk or act your losses away, but you can shed tears over them and allow yourself to grieve deeply. The world says just ignore it. Be strong. Don't cry. Get over it. Move on. But if you don't mourn, you can become bitter. All your grief can go right into your deepest self and sit there for the rest of your life. It is better to mourn your losses than to deny them, he concludes. And after inviting us to name and mourn our losses, he would join us in our pain. He would not leave us alone. There is nothing as healing as a person standing with us in our pain, not aiming to fix or cure us, but just being with us in our vulnerable state. Henri liked to illustrate this idea with the biblical story of Jesus' reaction to the grief of a widow who had just lost her only son. From Luke. And when the Lord saw her, he had compassion for her and said unto her, "Weep not." Another way of translating the words, "he had compassion," Henri would remind us, is to say, Jesus felt the widow's pain in his guts. This is compassion. Compassion is to let the pain of others connect with your own. Henri taught that the word compassion literally means to suffer with. Many people can't do this. It's too frightening. It requires a willingness to be vulnerable. But Henri Nouwen modeled this kind of compassion and solidarity with people who suffered. I can't count the number of times he dropped whatever he was doing to get to the bedside of a sick friend. He would hold their hand, be with them, and feel their pain in his guts. When my son Heiko died, I had a powerful experience of compassion. On the day after we left his lifeless body in the hospital morgue, we had a knock on our door. My husband and I opened it to find our neighbors, Stan and Hiroko, and their teenage daughter Miyuki, standing there. Their faces were mirrors of our sorrow. The visit was less than a minute, and very few words were spoken, but they stood with us in the pain, and it was very healing. Our neighbors showed us human solidarity, but there's more. Henri would remind us that we can connect our pain to a larger pain. He would say, nothing we are experiencing is alien to God. All has been suffered already by Jesus. Loss, humiliation, torture, powerlessness, abandonment, death. Jesus lifts up our suffering to himself and joins our suffering to his all-compassionate heart. This is divine solidarity. I was shown how to join my pain to the larger pain by Sister Sue Mosteller, one of Henri's dear friends. Sue walked with me closely during the first few years after Heiko's death. One day she suggested that I connect my sorrow about Heiko with Mary, Jesus' mother, who had also lost her only son. It was hard at first. I was so seared into isolation by my own experience that I resisted. But eventually, using my imagination, I would sit with Mary and then all the other women around the world grieving their lost children. I was comforted by our mutual longing and grief. A natural question after experiencing loss is, why me? We try to find explanations and root causes to know if we could have changed the outcome. By joining with Mary and other mothers who had lost children, I was able to begin the process of letting go of the whys and ifs and find comfort in my sameness with others. The finding of community, even if just in my imagination, opened up the possibility that Heiko's death was not an aberration. It was part of the human experience. This was healing because, as hard as it is to admit now, for months after Heiko's death, I was heavy with a burden that my life was cursed. Heiko's death was not the first major loss in my life. My father died when I was 2 years old, and my best friend Nikki died of cystic fibrosis in our final year of high school. Other deaths followed, and when death came from my beautiful son, I had chilling thoughts that everything I loved was taken away from me. I tried to make sense of death's regular visitations, and in the deepest chambers of my heart, I struggled with the distressing idea that I was doomed by God to a life of loss because I was not worthy of love. Thinking of my life as cursed had two corrosive effects. It made me blame and evaluate myself as unworthy of lasting relationships, and perhaps worse, it made me question the reality of a loving God. Henri understands this very human reaction to loss. He writes, "When we lose a family member or friend through death, when we become jobless, when we fail an examination, when we live through a separation or divorce, when a war breaks out, when an earthquake destroys our home or touches us, the question why spontaneously emerges. Why me? Why now? Why here?" It's so arduous to live without an answer to this why that we are easily seduced into connecting the events over which we have no control with our conscious or unconscious evaluation. When we have cursed ourselves, it is very tempting to explain all the brokenness we experience as an expression or confirmation of this curse. Before we fully realize it, we have already said to ourselves, "You see, I always thought I was no good. Now I know for sure. The facts of life prove it." What a relief it was for me to read these words all those years ago. It seems to have been written just for me. Henri names with such accuracy the roots of my suffering, self-blame, and an evaluation of myself as unworthy of love. His antidote is counterintuitive at first. He says, we must place our loss under a blessing. The great spiritual call of the beloved children of God, he writes, is to pull their brokenness away from the shadow of the curse and put it under the light of the blessing. This is not as easy as it sounds, he continues. The power of the darkness around us is strong, and our world finds it easier to manipulate self-rejecting people than self-accepting people. But when we listen attentively to the voice calling us the beloved, it becomes possible to live our brokenness not as a confirmation of our fear that we are worthless, but as an opportunity to purify and deepen the blessing that rests upon us. Physical, mental, or emotional pain lived under the blessing is experienced in ways radically different from physical, mental, or emotional pain lived under the curse. Henri was asking me to put Heiko's death under the light of the blessing. I can share with you that this is indeed easier said than done. But I do believe that when I chose to live my life under the blessing and took it on as a real discipline, meaning I practiced it with intentionality, I began to experience a lifting of the guilt and shame that shrouded me and kept me locked in darkness. The key was learning to accept that suffering is not evidence of an uncaring, unloving God, but instead is an opportunity to experience God's love right in the midst of it. When I began to shift my focus from what I had lost to the reality of the love coming to me through so many various ways, through the love of my friends, family, my church community, from strangers, from doctors, from nurses, from flowers, from trees, gifts, meals, toys for Heiko, quilts, and cards. I was overwhelmed by the reality that God indeed never left me alone. Suffering comes with the territory of being human. But what a difference it makes to think of suffering as an opportunity to experience God's presence. The words of the psalmist began to take on a renewed power for me. Psalm 23, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff comfort me." I've brought along a special recording of this psalm, Psalm 23, and Kevin is going to help me play it now. It's a recording of Bobby McFerrin's arrangement as sung by me and my United Church choir. We created the recording for Lynn, my friend I mentioned at the beginning. She was dying, and these words of the psalmist, like they did for me, gave her great comfort. And my choir recorded this for her. Amen. I would recite Psalm 23 to remind myself of my decision to live under the blessing and to feel God's presence in my loss. And when I did this, something beautiful happened. I was able to let myself feel Heiko's love for me again and love him back. When I focused on the tragedy of his death, I wasn't able to let in the love of my son. It was too painful. It pressed in on the sore places where he was absent. Yet when I shifted my perspective from curse to blessing, a new portal of creative energy opened between us. This idea that one person's love for another can be a portal to something new and generative is cogently expressed in a poem that became important to me in the months after Heiko's death. It's called Mother Root by Mary Lou Awiakta, a Cherokee, Scots-Irish, and Appalachian poet from Tennessee. Awiakta wrote the poem to acknowledge the role of her mother and husband in her life, but I read it as a love song between Heiko and me. It is about the root that holds me steady. Mother Root. Creation often needs two hearts, one to root and one to flower, and one to sustain in times of drought and hold fast against winds of pain the fragile bloom that in the glory of its hour affirms a heart unsung, unseen. This beautiful poem is about the people who are in the nurturing position and those in the blooming position. I had to metamorphize my role of mother and let Heiko be the root, the nurturer. But when I did, I transmuted his death to life by becoming alive again myself. My blooming is only possible when I connect to his nurturing love. My ability to reclaim my relationship with my son didn't happen overnight or even over years. It is a long, arduous journey that continues to this day. But it points to something important. Part of any journey from loss to hope is to claim our past. Henri says, what is forgotten is unavailable, and what is unavailable cannot be healed. It is tempting to shut down after loss. For years, I couldn't look at photographs of my life with Heiko, and even to this day, I can't see his face without both a pang of longing along with the surge of joy. Henri understands. In his book Here and Now, he writes, when we look back at all that has happened to us, we easily divide our lives into good things to be grateful for and bad things to forget. But with a past thus divided, we cannot move freely into the future. With many things to forget, we can only limp toward the future. His remedy for this condition is one of the great spiritual challenges. Even after loss, especially after loss, we must choose to be grateful for all that we have lived. He says, true spiritual gratitude embraces all of our past, the good as well as the bad events, the joyful as well as the sorrowful moments. Everything that took place brought us to this moment, and we want to remember all of it as part of God's guidance. That does not mean that all that has happened in the past was good, he reminds us, but it does mean that even the bad didn't happen outside the loving presence of God. Another equally important truth is connected to this idea of claiming the good and the bad of our past. It is this: we must accept that we live in a world surrounded by the powers and principalities of evil, death, and destruction. Why is this healing? Because by accepting the reality of the human condition, we are better able to live our suffering not as something to rebel against, but as an opportunity to change our hearts. In his book, Reaching Out, Henri writes, every time in history that men and women have been able to respond to the events of their lives as an occasion to change their hearts an inexhaustible source of generosity and new life has been opened, offering hope far beyond the limits of human prediction. We heal from loss not by rebelling against the situation, but by keeping our hearts open for love. By no longer suppressing reality, we can live in a spirit of gratitude. What I have been suggesting as ways to live loss are not easy. They are challenging, particularly spiritually challenging. And you, like me, will need help. Henri was convinced that nothing was as important than regular time each day for dwelling with God. A daily practice of prayer is a statement to yourself that God's love is a reality, and that with God's love, you are able to live your losses in a way that bring life. Prayer is a necessary component of any journey from loss to hope. It is the place where living with gratitude begins. It's the place where our capacity to be free for others has its roots. It is the place where we hear God's voice that calls us the beloved. And it is the place we can bring our broken hearts to rest. How do we pray? Henri would say, set aside at least 10 minutes a day to waste time with God. Waste time, you might say? I don't have enough time as it is. And I understand. I struggle with the same issue. But our concern with time belies what we sometimes do with our prayer lives. We try to make them productive. But Henri is calling us to a different kind of prayer. Henri is inviting us to create space in our lives for nothing but listening to God. This might involve carving out a sacred space in your home. It could be a room or just a corner or shelf. But in some way, we need a place set apart from the hurly-burly of our busy lives. Light a candle. Put out meaningful images that draw you closer to the divine. Henri himself prayed every day in the morning, even when he felt apathetic or spiritually arid, which was more often than you might think. He would read a scriptural passage or some other word of wisdom and sit with the words in silence, allowing any images to emerge in his mind. He would try to enter into the words as deeply as possible, so they, in his words, found a home in him. I particularly like his habit of then hanging these images on the walls of his inner room, so that throughout the day, when he met with people, they were nurtured by them too. In his book, Here and Now, he wrote, "Whenever I meet people during the day, I receive them in my inner room, trusting that the pictures on my walls will guide our meeting." Shall we try this together? You're game for that? We won't do it for a very long time, but I think maybe about 3 minutes. And I thought what we might do is take the phrase, "She anoints my head with oil, and my cup overflows." And what we might do is, if you'd like, you could close your eyes and just allow those words to descend in you into this sacred center that we all have. And just keep repeating those words. She anoints my head with oil, and my cup overflows. Just keep repeating those words, even when a thought comes in, then just repeat them again. And we'll do it for 3 minutes, and John is going to ring the bell to let us know when to begin and when to end. Thank you. Amen. By praying in this way, we deepen our connection to the reality of God's love in our lives and God's deep compassion for our pain. Now let's turn our attention to hope. How do we move from loss to hope? To help answer this question, I want to read a letter Henri wrote to a man called George. He wrote it in 1981. Henri Nouwen received over 16,000 letters in his lifetime, and all of them are preserved in the Nouwen archives at the University of St. Michael's College in Toronto. I had the great privilege of compiling some of Henri's letters of response into a book called Love Henri, Letters on the Spiritual Life. In the letter I'm going to read, George has written to Henri asking if humanity would survive the century. At that time, in 1981, the world was on high alert, not by a pandemic like us, but by the threat of nuclear war. Henri writes, "Dear George, I really don't know if our civilization will survive the century. Considering the growing threat of a nuclear holocaust, there certainly is reason to wonder. But important for me is not if our civilization will survive or not, but if we can continue to live with hope. And I really think we can, because our Lord has given us his promise that he will stay with us at all times. He is the God of the living. He has overcome evil and death, and his love is stronger than any form of death and destruction. That is why I feel that we should continually avoid the temptation of despair and deepen our awareness that God is present in the midst of all the chaos that surrounds us, and that presence allows us to live joyfully and peacefully in a world so filled with sorrow and conflict. Please be sure of my prayers for you in these tempting times. Peace, Henri Nouwen." It is tempting to fall into despair at the persistent number of losses we each face, both personally and collectively. But Henri asks us to move from despair to hope. Hope is very different from optimism. As Henri explains, optimism is the expectation that things will get better. Hope is the trust that God will fulfill God's promises to us in a way that leads us to true freedom. The optimist speaks about concrete changes in the future. The person of hope lives in the moment with the knowledge and trust that all of life is in good hands. I could not be an optimist about Heiko's death. Nothing was going to bring him back. But I could be hopeful that his death and my reaction to it could lead to true freedom. I couldn't change what happened, but I could trust that all that happened was part of a larger story of God's love. When I let go of Heiko's death as an aberration, when I let go of seeing myself as cursed, when I named my loss and mourned it, when I connected my pain to the greater pain and let my suffering be an experience of God's love, I was able to slowly move from bitterness to gratitude, from a hardened heart to a soft one. And by some mysterious alchemy, Heiko's death was redeemed. If my grief had kept me locked in despair, I would never have tasted the sweet fruit of love. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for coming. Thanks for bringing your sorrow here. You've introduced us to a spiritual guide, Henri Nouwen, and I think another one, Gabrielle Earnshaw.
Or Heiko.
Or both. But you've opened us up to this reality, this teaching, and I wonder if there might be some questions. I'd be happy to take them for you. If there are some questions, I'm also following them online here. So are there any questions? You are free to come to the microphone if you'd like to ask a question. That will allow those who are listening online to hear them as well. So take your time. I think there's a lot to think about here. You do have a question. Thank you.
First of all, I think Haiku was with us tonight. He's a lovely boy. I haven't read any Henri Nouwen. I just know of him. Could you suggest what might be the easiest book to access?
I think The Life of the Beloved might be a good place to start. It was actually written in the same year, in the same year that he published The Return of the Prodigal Son. It's a spiritual masterpiece. But The Life of the Beloved is much, well, they're both wonderful, but The Life of the Beloved was written for a man who was struggling with his belief, and Henri Nouwen was never actually able to bring this man back to his faith, but for his readers, many people say that this is the book that helped them really ingest or really come to know God's love for them. So that might be a nice place to start.
Thank you so much. I wanted to take advantage of your skill as a biographer and ask a very specific question.
Okay.
So, given this landscape of loneliness, this one feature or landscape of brokenness, the feature of violence and terror, of which he experienced more than once in his lifetime, first probably as a child in occupied Holland, between 8 and 12 years old, and secondly, during the march in Selma in 1965, which he participated in, of which 100 protesters were beaten by the Alabama State Police. So that feature of violence and terror in his life, how did he reflect on that?
Well, I think that because it's such a feature of his life, trauma was a feature of his life, that it's almost as though his vocation springs from that. So the March to Selma that you're referencing, Henri Nouwen says that that's the first time that he felt fear. When he was a child in Holland during the Second World War, he himself didn't experience fear because his parents did such a good job of protecting him as a child from the terrors and the violence of the war. But when he got to Selma, that was the first time when he learned about fear viscerally, and it was a very searing experience. And I think it is part of why he, stayed in North America, and he was, this was an experience that he was formative, I would say. But there were other traumas in his life as well. He, for whatever reason, and as the biographer, I guess I'm going to have to grapple with this, but he never felt like he had, that he was acceptable, that he was accepted, that he belonged. There was this, the hungry ghost of longing. And I think it's connected with trauma. So I would, that's the word I would use as opposed to violence, and I'm not sure the other word, terror. I think that that's the lens that I'll be looking at it, trying to understand Henri Nouwen through the lens of trauma, partially. I think the danger is that you can overemphasize that experience, and it can then overshadow his natural gifts, so it's going to be to find that balance between how trauma formed and shaped him and how it affected his ministry, but then also his temperament and his natural gifts and his education and his family background, and all of those factors influenced who he became and how he could be who he was, which was a man who struggled a lot, and yet was able to turn it into something so meaningful for other people, so transformative for other people. And then, like I said in the talk this morning, I think that he transcended it, the violence, the terror, the trauma. I think that it was never this, we're done, but it was, like he was saying, a change of heart. It's an interior sense of peacefulness within himself that I think emerged later in his life. Yeah, through a lot of work, through a very concerted, deep spiritual journey. Thanks for the
Gabrielle,
question.
We do have an online question as well. Mark asks, I'm curious to hear about your experience of the transition from sorrow to the acceptance of life's challenges being a part of God's love.
Well, I think, as I said, that when I experienced Heiko's death, there was this sense that okay, well, now my life is over. That's it. And what am I going to do with the rest of my life? Okay, I'm going to have to live it, but really, it was over. It was a very powerful experience that maybe some people here have had too, where this seems like there's absolutely no point. But this poem, Mother Root, this idea, I think the reason why that poem has been such a touchstone for me is that I think deep down, I believe that every human being has to be available for others. That we don't really have the option to shut down completely because it affects so many people. It reverberates so far out. So when I found this image of Heiko being my nurturer, and that meant that then I could bloom, something changed for me, because I no longer felt like I was betraying him and betraying his death and moving on, and absolutely that was not going to happen. But what did happen was that I could bloom, I could live, I could become generative, I could become a person that can be available for others because Heiko is with me. It comes from that deep place. So that's part of it. I mean, this is the first time I'm speaking about Heiko. You might have noticed that I was a bit tearful because I haven't spoken about him in 13 years. 13 years. So this is a long journey. This is not something that happens, and I'm still in the working of it. But I do think that each of us has I don't know if I want to call it responsibility but we're important. we're important to other people. And how our healing happens affects everyone around us, and not just our immediate family, everyone, we're that interconnected. That's my belief, that we're that interconnected. That if I stayed stuck in sorrow, it would be more affecting than just my own life.
And thank you from the questioner online.
Okay.
For your answer. Any other questions at this time?
Or comments.
Or comments.
Or just wanting to share something that came up for you. I mean, it's a topic that's, it's really heart-centered. It's not really the head.
Yeah.
Yeah. So hopefully, this will you'll go into the world thinking about these things and how you're going to live your own losses. That brings hope and life to others.
I'm curious about what you would say about loneliness, because I experience a lot of loneliness in the world, and mostly people define it as you have defined it with Henri, which is that you feel somehow that you're not worthy. And that's not my experience of it. My experience is more a feeling as if I'm not met. Not that I'm not worthy, but I'm not met in the way I would like to be met.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't even know then if the word is loneliness or if there's a different word for it. Perhaps it's something we all experience, and not feeling that. So any thoughts on that word loneliness?
Well, what immediately came to mind when you said not being met is not being known. There's I'm sure several of you have experienced this, when you're seen, when somebody actually sees you, it's rare, right? They become really special people in your life because they're seeing you and you're known. And so I guess I would say it is a rare thing, because people busy and have their own sorrows and their own loss. But I think that experience of being known is a longing, and I think it's a human longing. And I think what Henri would say about it is that's where, developing a communion with God being love, God being unconditional love. And that's so that you're not expecting from human beings what only God can give. So Henri called that the first love. God's love is the first love, and human love is the second love. And when we expect something of the second love that only the first love can give, there's going to be, you're going to feel that, why isn't that person called me? And Henri could speak about this very personally. He would, why hasn't that person called me? Why hasn't that person invited me out to their party? But he was expecting something from the second love that really comes from the first love. And of course, that's very difficult. I mean, God, as present as God is not in a physical form. And so it becomes a spiritual practice, I think. Not easy. Yeah.
I'm interested in what you said about this idea of gratitude and being intentional about gratitude. And I was wondering if Henri Nouwen had any type of ritual or specific practice that he spoke about that he would do to encourage, because it's hard to do that only as the head.
Yeah.
So what would be the practice to bring gratitude in that intentional way?
That's a good question. So I'll just acknowledge that, yes, it is difficult, because I think the natural response is to say, this isn't fair, or, I don't like this. But let's see, I think it would be part of something larger. It's a way of being in the world. It's a way of, understanding your relationship to your own life. Is your life, to only receive and to not feel pain and to not experience loss? Then when loss happens, you say something's wrong. Something terrible has happened. But if we've set our hearts differently, and we're saying this is part of life, and I'll stand in it. Henry used to always, not always, but he would talk about standing erect in the face of death or loss or hardship. Standing erect. That's another discipline. So I guess I would say that gratitude is part of a larger way of how do you understand yourself? What's your, who are you as a human being, and what is to be expected of the human experience? And maybe it might be about checking into what are my expectations around life? And is that why I'm responding, when something doesn't work? But I can also say that Henri Nouwen prayed every day. He said the Eucharist every day. So he was steeped in this, and he would make it very intentional in the morning and in the evening. So he spent a lot of time at it. Let's put it that way.
We do have a couple more comments.
Comments, great.
Online, so I'd like to read those for you. I just have to scroll up a bit. I apologize. So one is from Carolyn.
Carolyn?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you, Gabrielle, for speaking from your heart so profoundly. Thank you for your courage in sharing with us what has helped you to live deeply and truthfully through these years. We have a responsibility to each other, you said, and you modeled something generous and brave tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Carolyn. I know her. She's a friend. But it's very nice that she would share that.
Friends are good.
Yeah, friends are good.
Audrey has a comment as well. Dr. Raymond says in his book, Life After Loss, page 152, blessings received from loss. Spirituality increased. Quote, what happens during this lifetime is not always my choice, but what I gain from it is. Just a citation from that book.
Yeah, it's how we look at things. Yeah.
Do we have any other comments or questions?
Okay, well, thank you for coming and for listening.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you so much, Gabrielle, for this powerful talk. It really is life-giving force. And I think it's something that will sit with us for a while as we reflect on it. Should let you also know, those of you who are viewing this virtually, who are here with us virtually, as well as those here, this will soon appear, this lecture, on St. Mark's YouTube channel. And you can find that on YouTube by going to St. Mark's YouTube channel. You can already find Dr. Michael Higgins' lecture of October the 1st there. So please keep your eyes on that. Let your friends know about it, especially those who live in time zones that have too many hours distant to maybe stay up with us. I also want to thank all my colleagues at St. Mark's College, Corpus Christi College, the Parish of St. Mark's, who allow such an event to take place. Students as well, volunteers, one of whom you see there, they really are wonderful, and we appreciate all they do. I want those of you listening, both here and online, to contact me with any questions or comments if there's anything you want to discuss regarding the Center for Christian Engagement, anything you'd like to see, lecture topics, things you'd like, programming you'd like to participate in. And you can contact me at jmartins@stmarkscollege.ca. For those of you who are with us here in person, and this I can't offer virtually, please feel free to join us for refreshments just outside the door and to the right in Plato's Cave. I'd like you all at home and here to join me one more time in thanking our guest, our speaker, Gabrielle Earnshaw. Thank you so much for coming.